Okay, we're live. So it's December 12th, 2014, 11 a.m. Pacific, and this is DB Hangups. Today we're going to be talking about credentials, kind of management, and just things around that for MySQL credentials. And then the other really big topic is how to work with them. And if we have time, talking about maybe some stuff coming up in 5. So I'm Jeff. Introduction to start with you, Jeremy.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Tinley.
Jeremy.
I'm the DBA at Etsy.com.
Okay, and then Mark.
Hey, I'm Mark Leith. I'm a development manager at Oracle.
Okay, Shlomi.
You're lagging by the sounds of things, Jeff.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Shlomi. I'm engineer at Outbrain.
And I'm Tim Callahan at Tokutech.
Okay, so it sounds like I've got some intense latency going right now.
High quality.
So I just want to get the topic started, which is credentials. How do you set them up? How do you store them? Who can see them? And since I'm lagging, I'm going to jump out and back in real quick.
So I guess that's really one for you or Jeremy, right, Shlomi? I mean.
Yeah. I raised the topic last time. So yeah, what I wanted to discuss was like how do you set credentials? What type of credentials you provide? Which users? How much do you separate users? How many accounts do you provide to your application, etc. I can start with how we do stuff. So there are application users, and then there are personal credentials. For personal credentials, we take the sudo approach. So we don't use the root account. It exists. It exists just for the sake of a few triggers with definer equals rooted local or stuff like that, just for the sake of its existence. But it's actually disabled. No one can log in with root. We've reversed its password. I used common schema for that, and no one can use it. So the few DBAs we have personal accounts, and they're almighty gods on the database. Then we have second-level personal accounts for all sorts of ITs and ops that are allowed to log into the database and start stop a slave or do stuff like that, maybe select into outfile, but they're not allowed to actually modify data or drop tables, etc. So we have a second-level tier of they have process, they may have super, they may have file privileges, etc., but not create, drop, select, or insert, delete, etc. Then we have the application accounts, where we typically limit the application to just select, insert, update, and delete, maybe create temporary table, execute for routines, the very basic stuff. And we try to do as much separation between our different applications. We have like dozens of different services, so obviously we don't have an account for each and every service, but we do try to isolate those credentials. So we have some services which are read-only on some databases, so we have read-only accounts that can only select or maybe create a temporary table, but are not allowed to insert, update, delete. And then we try to separate. We have a few of these couples, like we have the read-write version of an account, and then we have the read-only version of that account, the same account. So, we group some services under specific accounts, and overall we have like maybe a dozen accounts that are targeted at services. So I'm wondering how everybody else is doing that. That's how we settle down. Not too many accounts, not too many different setups, etc. Yeah. So
I can chime in on that. I mean, for us, same thing where your application, you have kind of read-write accounts and then read-only accounts for everything. And specifically, the biggest benefit we got with that is when we upgraded to Percona Server 5.5, we enabled the user stat plugin, which allows you to do show user underscore statistics and get access to all this additional information about number of connections that a user has, CPU time they've consumed. And what we found very valuable about that is we can actually interrogate if, for any reason whatsoever, a read-write account is trying to connect to a slave, or if a read-only account is going to the master, and that allows us to see if our application is not properly honoring things. Now, obviously, you have read-only mode enabled on your replicas so that you don't have concerns about read-write changing things. But the additional thing there is, like Shlomi said, having named accounts for every person who actually is going to access the server or needs to access the data. And that's also allowed us to tell if we have a long-running script by another employee who is doing some sort of cleanup work, we're able to identify pretty quickly, like a spike in CPU on the database server correlates to a spike in CPU tied to a specific user account. And we can work with that person to, control or work down the amount of work that he's doing. But yeah. Something that I wanted to chime in about too, though, was the lack of, I'm going to put it in quotes, just the lack of role management that MySQL, it doesn't have that are in other products.
Yeah.
And I'm curious how other folks deal with that.
So I can just mention that there is some role management in MariaDB. I haven't worked with that. And there used to be this open source tool, I forget the name, that mimics roles for MySQL. Maybe Mark recalls the name.
I know what you're talking about, but I can't remember the name off the top of my head either. Wasn't it just in Swanhart that did it, though?
It's a set of stored routines that operate on top of the MySQL user table. It will pop into my mind in a few minutes, I'm sure.
Yeah, most other people just end up scripting roles at some layer outside of the database, right? Be it some puppet config or chef config and all of those kind of things. They end up either being quite wide open and granting people too much, or being very specific. I've seen both ends of the scale. There are some companies that have literally very, very specific grants on all of the tables on a per day or on a per user basis.
Yeah.
And you can go either end of the scale. I mean, we generally with MEM and in our recommendations we generally tell people to use role-specific logins for those kind of things. Just pretty much the way that you're doing. Things like having a very specific backup user that can select from everything but can't do anything else on the server. Those kind of things. The only thing that you have to kind of be careful about, because of the lack of roles, really, at the end of the day, is if you want to be at the really specific end of the scale, per user, per table, even sometimes per column grants, for example, and have lots of users, then you have to be careful about the size of what's called the grant cache inside the server, which literally just reads all of the privilege information from the tables itself and caches it in the server, and can, in some cases, we've seen use quite a lot of memory. And the larger the size that gets as well, that's also taken whenever somebody executes a statement or something. We have to take this mutex called a lock grant, and you probably see it in things like performance schema. If you look at mutexes in there, it can become quite high with a huge privilege cache and a lot of concurrency on there.
Yeah, I never thought about it. I never used a very large, user privilege set. So typically a few dozens at most. And I never thought about going very high. Well, how would that impact every single executed statement? For every
It's kind
statement
of,
you need to go and check the.
yeah, I mean, you see it with, when you look at something like performance schema, at least, and watch the traces of those kind of things. There's a stage that everybody goes through. It's called check-in permissions, right? And check-in permissions is actually going off to the grant cache, the thing that's we basically pull the entire cache into memory, and then check the access privileges needed against that cache, and that's done under this lock grant mutex as well. It's just the quickest way we can do it, at the end of the day. But if you get very specific with lots and lots of privileges, then it's just going to grow the cache, and you can't really see what's in, the size of it at the moment, although 5.7 should start helping with that in performance schema, so you can't tell, how much is being cached, but if you've got a huge amount of grants, then they've all got to get into memory at the end of the day.
So Jeff, are you chefing your privileges?
Yeah, we use Puppet
Are you
for
deploying them
our
automatically? All right.
configuration management. Oh man, I think I'm still very lagged. But yeah, we use Puppet for all of our configuration management, and so it's something I've been rolling out over the past couple. A file of grants that we expect to be on a given machine, and then that's all dictated by an external system we have for assigning like a cluster identifier and some other information to a given instance of MySQL. And so I have a piece of some code that I put together that I've just croned a little script that will consume this grant file and treat it as the source of truth and connect to the local instances of MySQL on a given machine. And for each of the grants in the file, ensure that they exist on the server. If they don't, go ahead and add them. And then if there's any sort of things that are out of sync, like maybe the server has a grant that's not in the file, to flag it as something that could be problematic. And then later on, we can go back with the remove option and actually blow those away. By default, I have it running without with binlog disabled anytime it applies changes, but that is something that can be disabled so that you can let it go through replication. It's just I've been a little hesitant about letting privileges and user drops kind of replicate through the topologies at times, because if you have a grant on a master and it's missing on the slave and you try to revoke that, replication on the slave is going to stop because it doesn't have that privilege. So what I found is the more effective way to kind of deal with these things, if you can actually have it, is issue a grant usage on the master and then immediately issue a drop user right after, and that allows you to do a clean drop of the account on all replicas and then recreate the account with the correct privileges. And so that's something that we've been, it's been interesting kind of seeing how our environment's built now, where initially a lot of our servers were cloned from one another using extra backup. And so we have grants from that trace all the way back to the original server, like empty user, like the string quote, quote at some host name. And it's an account we forgot to clean up way back when, and it's been extra backup cloned to a bunch of machines. So this account with a host name for a different server is on every single master that we have to clean up now.
Yeah. So if you automate your grants, if you have automated deployments for your privileges, that means the chef client or the Puppet client or whatever it is that runs on your servers has a root access to your MySQLs in order to be able to do grants. So where do you store these credentials?
So that's a good question. It actually doesn't have, so Puppet doesn't run the tool. It just generates a file that the tool consumes. And we have a separate account that is put into a config file that the tool can use that's locked down so only the tool can read it under a specific user account on the operating system. And I mean, we have a bunch of automated user accounts for doing various tasks, so this just has another one that is deployed. And so all the logic that generates this source of truth grant file is also the same logic that does the initial setup of MySQL on a newly provisioned machine. So if the server is freshly kicked, Puppet will do the setup, creating the instance and everything, and there's a shell script we have that runs that will consume these grants that are built on the fly and basically automatically grant all the DBAs access, automated user accounts, and monitoring accounts for like Nagios and whatnot. And that way, when we kickstart a new machine, it's up and running within probably about 10 or 15 minutes, and already in all the alerting systems and ready to be populated.
So I remember at one point, Jeff, you guys were talking about looking at the external authentication plugins, or was it you? I think it was you or somebody else on here.
I did look at the LDAP plugin at one point. Every time I tried to load the plugin, restarting the server would crash. So I had set it aside at the time. And I mean, we have thought about bringing it back in for being able to just go to LDAP for it. But the concern we still had was around application accounts that have thousands of connections a second, and the kind of concerns that might occur if there's any sort of problem with the
Right. Yeah, the reason I bring it up is because with external auth, there's also these proxy users as well, where basically the externally authenticated user behaves as if, almost as if a proxy, and will behave and then become this other user. And it's pretty much like roles. You can almost think of it like roles in that way, because what you're doing is you set up a user with the specific privileges that are required, and then you proxy that user with the externally authenticated users. So they get all of the privileges that are needed just by proxying through that user. But I mean, that's just one thing that's worth noting, and that's with our authentication plugin. I think you were using the Pacona one, and I'm pretty sure it will work the same. The proxy user is still there in the Pacona server, and their author plugin does pretty much the same stuff at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So it's just another option.
The LDAP plugin I used was a hand compiled one that I got off the internet somewhere, and might not have worked.
Yeah, it's just another option to think about, especially if somebody's really wanting roles and really wanting to have otherwise very specific users with external auth. It's a good option.
I'm actually curious, is anyone aware of a blog post or documentation around proxy users and like using them in a role-based type fashion? Because, I mean, I poked at them a little bit, but I'm not comfortable rolling it out yet.
I was looking for one, and I'm pretty sure somebody's done one. I thought Todd Farmer had done one at one point. I'll see if I can dig one up.
Yeah, I'm also curious what it's going to look like on the monitoring side for things like the user statistics plugin, because if you proxy to a user account, I can't remember the specifics. It was like current user or versus the current user function or something returns differently. And so I'd be interested to know like how that looks for the user statistics plugin, just when you go through a proxy account.
Yeah, no idea on the user stat stuff.
Okay. I'd like to hear from other people about how they do their just user management in MySQL. So Jeremy, if you want to chime in, and Tim, if there's any kind of fun things with Toku that you'd like to tell us about.
Sure. Ours is pretty straightforward. Similar to what Shlomi had mentioned, admin accounts to do sort of the core functionality for application accounts that have read-write and read-only separations. One of the challenges that I've kind of run into throughout all of MySQL has always been about password expiration and password rotation. It's generally a good idea to keep those things changing on a semi-frequent basis. One of the areas, I know 5.7 is going to add password expiration, which will be very nice, but curious how everybody else handles that. Do you have a timer that you use to just say, hey, it's time to rotate our passwords? Do you do it only when people leave?
It's worth noting that password expiration is in 5.6, not in 5.7. Yeah, 5.7 added a column which tells you the last time that the password was set, so that you can do automated expiration on top of it.
Yes, so we don't have a strict policy about password expiration, but we do have, manual decision made. Let's expire our passwords, and the way we do that is just we create a new account. And then start slowly to migrate our services into that new account, and if everything goes well, then we drop the old account. So we just, we never change a password. We have hundreds of services. We can't change the password at the same time for everyone. So we just roll into a new account.
Yeah, and that's what we end up having to do for just our application is to rotate the password for an application. You can't just flip the bit because you need to get the configuration trickled out to everybody. So and our repo, let it the accounts out, and we can verify it's on everything. Then push a configuration change to our application to make them aware of a new account and password to use. And then thanks to the user statistics plugin, which we collect and store into OpenTSDB, we just check that a couple hours later and see how many connections are still coming in on the old account. Provided it's 0, then we can just blow the old account away. It's one of those you probably wait another day or two just to make sure there's no crons or anything that might crop up using the old account. But that aside, if there is anything still connecting, that's when you can set up what I've done is set up a PT stalk that watches for that account to be in the process list, and then just dump the source host that has it, and then we can go investigate why there's still a machine with it. Typically, though, once the bulk of things have moved over, you're relatively safe to blow it away and just have your application log an error if it's still using stale credentials or something. But the other thing, so Shlomi and Jeremy, I'd be interested, what about DBAs having to change their passwords? Do you just do a set password, or do you also create a new account and switch over to it?
No, in the case of DBAs, we do have an occasional change password, and yeah, again, this isn't very much enforced. So we don't have a monthly or a yearly expiration time. So I'm pretty much the one who says, okay, you guys just have a new password. Here it is. Memorize it and burn the note. We still do that. Right.
Yeah,
it's like Jeffrey is gone.
I'd say the same. It's just up to whatever the DBA needs to do.
I don't have something to add TokuDB wise, but I do. I always feel like I'm a little late to the MySQL party. One thing I wonder is why. I always ask a lot of why questions. I think about MySQL. Why has security? Mark, you mentioned password expiration came in 5.6. Are there explanations or opinions on why really simple things like that are just coming along now, or maybe on the roadmap, or maybe not coming at all, which are what I'll call commonplace for other databases?
It's generally been the history of MySQL, right? I mean, the history of MySQL has never been within large enterprises and all of those kind of things. It's only with 5.0 when that came along, and there was this whole SAP thing trying to get us to grow up and be a database with real procedures and views and all of those kind of things. That the enterprisey type features didn't start coming along until then. As we get more and more into larger enterprises, I mean, we're literally everywhere now, right? I mean, from government through military, through government, through web, through whatever, right? Then we start to see more of these PCI compliance and all of those kind of requests, and those are the kind of things we're trying to fill. But for the most part, our niche is web databases at the end of the day, and there's not been a huge call for things like password exploration, for example, from our classic large voice, right, which is with the web properties at the most. So that's pretty much mostly what it is. We're focused on that niche for the most part, and they don't need that.
Sorry, am I back? Am I still lagging?
You're there?
You're okay.
Okay. All right, cool. I think I might be caught up finally. So I'm trying to figure out what all I've missed or what I've caught. But it sounds like, so we were talking about password expiration, password rotation. Okay. What were people's answers about DBAs changing their password? Do you just do a set password or change accounts?
Yeah, set a password because we like to have our accounts named after our LDAP accounts, same as SSH or Linux user. It's just easier that way.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, has anyone actually used LDAP, like an LDAP or external authentication plugin? Like Mark, I'm sure you probably have just by virtue of working there, but I'm curious if anyone else has in their environment.
I haven't used the Oracle plugins. I tested once. I think it was the PAM authentication by Picona. And the mere fact that the credentials were transferred in plain text was one thing that I said, okay, so what's the deal? Doesn't make sense to me. I don't know if that works the same with the Oracle plugins. MySQL communicates with the authentication server in plain text. So to me, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it is. It's the same with the Oracle ones as well. You have to have the plain text password in that case. But the thing that we recommend, if you are going to use that, is to then switch on SSL everywhere. And as long as SSL is enabled on the connections, then you're fine at the end of the day. So it's a multi-layered thing. It's not just depending on, or that's the way people should look at it. It's not just dependent on the auth plugin itself, but also make sure that the entire connection is secure too.
Okay. So are there other things folks want to talk about with respect to credential management? Things about setting them up, storing them, who's able to see them, or should we move on to the next topic?
I wanted to throw one thing out there. I know, Mark, you were saying that the cache size will grow as you increase your number of grants. Is there an expectation to see some sort of linear growth to your connect time as you increase grants?
I wouldn't necessarily call it a linear one for connect time at the end of the day. I mean, the entire set of privileges that you have aren't checked when you connect to the server, right? It doesn't check that you can access table XYZ, right? So it shouldn't be too much of a problem for connect time. You'd probably see some kind of growth when you're actually executing some kind of statements, though, the larger the cache gets. And the more concurrency you have as well, as they have issues accessing that cache.
Yeah, given that you have individual IPs and some security models really want you to lock things down to individual IPs and not necessarily subnets, I was really curious to know how much that impacts if you have just wide subnet ranges or wide IP ranges. Sounds like it's pretty negligible though.
Yeah, on connections, the only overhead, I mean, you have to take the memory hit at the end of the day because we're just going to cache all of that, and a slight hit as you scan through the cache to get the privileges.
So I did have one more thing on credentials I wanted to ask folks about, which is with MySQL, a credential is a user at host combination typically. And so for the host section, what do folks typically use here? Do you hard code IPs of specific machines or host names? Do you put some sort of percent matching? Do you just do the plain percent wildcard and that's it?
So I can tell you what we do in our systems. I mean, it's our lab systems and our own production systems actually internally. And we generally use a percent, but with the end being a area that we're in .oracle.com basically. So it's any machine within the domain basically is what we take.
Yeah, for the super sensitive stuff, like we're using propagator or orchestrator or some management tools that they only run from a couple of machines, then we have a specific IP or host name for those sensitive accounts. Otherwise, we use some form of wildcarding.
Yeah, we use wildcard where it makes sense. For general user info that's you can look up on the web anyway, it's all just wildcards. When you get into sensitive, then it's really locked down.
Okay, yeah, and we have the DNS resolution disabled on the server, so everything comes down to actual IP addresses if we're going to do any sort of wildcarding. And so we typically do a prefix of a lot of our network with a wildcard at the end. And the reason I was asking was I'd encountered and learned some fun things, which is the wildcard is actually like the absolute last matched account. So if you have let's say a 192.168% address and then a local host address and then a percent address, MySQL will go out of its way to match the more specific ones first, as it should. But if you connect through a local socket, that's typically going to hit the local host one and not the percent one. And if you have different privileges defined for those two, different hosts that you're connecting through, you can get a little messed up there. And that was something that I encountered in one of our development environments. So it's one of the interesting learning experiences. But okay, so I guess we'll move on to the next topic now, which is gaps. And so this was something that Sherry had brought up, and for folks who may not be familiar with the term, gaps refers to kind of identifying when you've hit the 80-20. So the whole idea of you want to put for a given investigation or something that you're working on, what's kind of the stopping point? When do you get to the point of diminishing return, and how do you identify that ahead of time? And so the first question under there is, how do you know when you've hit that 80-20 threshold? And so this is actually something I'd actually like to hear everyone's answer. Like for any given problem you're working on, when do you take the step back and maybe say that you're complete or done working on it?
Well, for me, it tends to be when I pick up my keys and I start sawing my wrist. That's usually when I know that I've probably exhausted my patience level on a particular issue. I think it's kind of gut. Have you solved the bulk of the issue? It's never exactly 80-20, but it's just a matter of when you've hit most of what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I'm reading the bullets on the topics. When do you stop automating and accept the manual? This is like something that shouldn't stop at 80-20. This should go 99-1, as far as you can. It's just a matter of resources. Whether your manager or team leader will give you the time to continue working on that. But I once read, I think it was maybe on one of Facebook's submissions on Become Alive, that any task you've done twice manually is worth automating. And I kind of like that. It's taken to the extreme, but I kind of like that.
Oh, I'll go next.
Otherwise, no, go ahead.
Something certainly we try to keep in mind here at Toku Tech, trying to make the databases we produce faster, is 80-20, as Shlomi said, isn't always an ideal split. But first and foremost, you certainly better measure what you're going to try to improve to convince yourself that there is a problem. Because far too often you can look at things and not even realize what the problem is. So using tools like perf or poor man's profiler from our perspective to get our head around where CPU cycles might be consumed or how much memory we're using or how big we are on disk. The other thing we always do is I make sure before we dive into an effort, the engineer who's going to do the work has to project how much better they can make something to make a convincing argument that am I going to get a potentially 1% improvement for 2 weeks work or 10%. And those are just educated guesses, but over time you can see with people, some people are more accurate than others, and you can trust, or maybe you measure more, or you get a second opinion on someone diving in before you do the work. We're a small company, so there is limited resources to work on the various problems we're trying to solve here. And I think you need to be careful sometimes about attacking a problem and convince yourself that it actually is a real problem. And I think we lost Jeff again.
Yeah. With database normalization, there's this saying, how far would you normalize your tables? And there's this saying, normalize till it works, normalize till it hurts, denormalize till it works. So there's a balance, and that balance can sometimes only be reached. You can only realize the true balance for you as you try to live with it. And the same is with engineering, the way I see it. There are some problems, and you're wondering whether you should tackle them or not. And sometimes you just need to give it some time and, okay, let's see how we can live with that. And if it's too painful, then you put an extra effort in engineering. If it's not too painful, then you have 100 other tasks to handle. So I guess the balance is whether it's painful to you to live with the 20% or the 15% or 10%. I know that with open source projects I work on, I always like to, okay, there's just one last thing I want to do, and sometimes it's just like, again, it's not going to make that much of a difference. It's just a little thing. You can't get to perfection. You can never achieve it.
I think.
I do have one other comment, Shlomi. You brought up automation, and my rule of thumb is I don't tend to automate things until they hurt a little bit. Mostly because I find if I automate something too soon in my process, I don't realize the optimal way to automate it, or how I might put too much time and effort into automating something that could have been done another way. So that's a struggle for me, is when I automate something, how painful I let it become before I get there to convince myself I know what the right path is to do the automation.
Yes, so you're in a great position because we are in a never-ending depth of automation. We're in so much need for automation that it's very clear that we have to have more and more of it. And as the product grows sometimes much faster than you can automate everything, because you're experimenting with stuff and new technologies, and it takes time until you understand what you should automate. But we are always lagging with automation behind development, because that's how it goes. So in your case, you have one product, one thing, and it's a great thing that you can actually think about whether I should put automation right away or not. Sometimes it can be done, but in many cases we're just experiment with new technology, and we haven't figured out yet what are the pains. So you just go do it as you go.
It's definitely an iterative process, though, and so that's something that I've come to learn just while working here and kind of dealing with the things that we have day to day, where maybe something's painful, and just kind of the Facebook mantra you had mentioned earlier, Shlomi, around if you have to do something twice, at that point you should automate it. And the ultimate thing is, to make the best automation, you'll probably build out this really great framework that allows you to do a lot of stuff and have some very high-level interaction. It's highly available, but doing that right off the bat is just it's such diminishing return there. And so I think what we've really been trying to push and kind of preach and profess to the rest of our organization is start with the small things. Like if you always go to the monitoring system and type in the same metric to bring up a graph, the first step of automation there is one, bookmark it. And two, if you're always punching in a different host name, find a way to have your monitoring system automatically resolve that host name for you, even if it's just like a shell script you run real quick to spit out a link. And then just kind of the gradual iteration there, a command that you always tend to run when you connect to a machine, write an alias for it. I mean, one of my favorites that I got from another person working here was, how many times do you run an output and then have to do awk print $1 or print $2? I mean, or maybe you do cut, the number of times that you just try to get at field 1 or field 2 from some sort of output, maybe from the process list. A coworker of mine created these aliases in all capital letters 1, and so anytime, and that's always going to be field 1, white space delimited. And he did 1 through 9, and the whole idea being, a lot of the time you just need to get at that one field. Why type out all of these letters for the awk or the cut statement when you can just pipe it into this one specific one? I mean, another one I have is just an alias for turning multi-line output into one line that's pipe delimited. And it's simple things like that that become extremely useful for helping you just get through your workflow faster, but also helping you identify automation gaps. If you start chaining a bunch of these things together, maybe you're at a point where you need to write a discrete script. And at that point, you can share the script with other people, and then other folks can iterate on need associative arrays or hashes. So Bash actually seems like not as good a fit now. Maybe we should write this in another language and start iterating more. And I mean, that's just kind of my high-level takeaway. Like, Shlomi, when you put together Orchestrator for managing replication, that is a case where you've probably just had to deal with replication in so many ways. You've probably had so many different tools to change replication, and you just got to a point, I want a point-and-click interface so I can make, Bob over in the other team be able to do it if he needs to. But that's kind of my take on the automation front.
Yeah.
I've got a kind of different one. Our problems as software developers are probably more like Tim's, right? Focused on those things. So I mean, our problems with automation are really around automating tests for the most part, and benchmark infrastructure and all of those kind of things. And the 80-20 rule there is really a lot of the time those kind of things. It's more with coverage, right? It's almost quite easy to get to one of the examples there is it's quite easy to get to 80% coverage. Well, not quite easy, not when you got something like MySQL, but when you start getting into that last 20%, right? That's the really hard part. But also along with the automated test framework you have to put in for some of the things like continuous benchmarks for regression testing and all of those kind of things. That's been a lot of hard work on our side, but it's paid off a hell of a lot as well. It's one of these big things. The other thing when you look at these kind of things is sometimes you have to spend that time, right? You even though somebody says, oh, this is going to take 6 months to do and get right, sometimes the choice is it's right to spend that 6 months to do and get right at the end of the day, right? Especially with some of these kind of frameworks that we have to deal with. That's our input. I mean, it's hard from the testing side, especially. And
how many of you?
I'd also agree. Test? I mean, there's how many of our guys?
Sorry, well, I just realized how lagged I am. I actually want just a question for everybody. Any automation you write, how many of you write full-on unit tests for it?
Tests for the automated things? Testing that the automated thing works, you mean?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. So the kind of test that you do for automated is like tests for automated backups, tests for For example, for Orchestrator, which is an automated tool, you have to test. You have monitor in that. We have then application level tests that monitor the results of those metrics, and yeah, things are pretty much covered even for automation.
Yeah, I think that falls under general monitoring, right? In the ideal world, you monitor every damn thing you possibly can, right? And that's where you get all these Nagios scripts and all of those kind of things, where they test that a backup's been done, or they test that some other process is up, or whatever it might be. It's all down to good monitoring at the end of the day. Apart from us, right? I mean, in our case, the automated tests tell us that something's gone wrong, right? Because the test fails. I mean, for us, our automation is all through something like Jenkins, right? Well, it is through Jenkins for the most part for us. For the server team, it's through something called push build, where each push is taken and run across a huge farm of servers with all different kinds of tests. And the thing that fails is the test then, right?
All right, so Jeffrey asks that we declare the next topic. So next subtopic, when you stop optimize in a bad query. That's a tough one. You stop optimizing a bad query when it requires too many changes to too many large tables that you just don't have the time, or you just, I don't want to get into that again. That's where you. I'm half kidding. You do that when the impact for your further changes will impact so many different people that you just say, okay, it's suboptimal. We can live with that. Let's go. Let's get on with our lives.
Yeah,
ideally.
Just trying to find, where the balance is between all the other things you have to do. I mean, how site impacting is that query? Is it hitting every user? Is it hitting every one of every 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 users? Is it a cron process? It's so subjective to how it works in your workload and where it fits on your scale that it's almost too difficult to answer. In general, it's just prioritization is really all, and really that's actually what the 80-20 thing is all about. Is when do you have something more important come up, or when do you shift to something that is really just needs to drive your attention away from whatever the percentage you're on is at.
I have a question about optimizing queries. So, three of us on this call. If you're attacking a query problem and you're considering adding an index or changing an existing index, how do you measure the impact not just to the query you're trying to help, but the potential positive or negative impact to the rest of the workload?
There's some. I can't say that I do it all the way scientific-wise. I don't benchmark any single ad index that I ever do. Sometimes it's just common wisdom, your experience as a DBA, and you say, I'm going to add this index and whatever. And sometimes you say, I'm going to add this index and whatever happens, we're going to have to live with it. Okay, so we're going to have to optimize the inserts later on, but I want that index. So I guess, when you get to 7, 8 indexes on the table, then you start, okay, do I really want another index or another 5 indexes or whatever? It's just, many times it's just by, rule of thumb. And let your expertise lead you.
So my experience with that has been. Okay, I think I'll talk real quick since I might be lagged. But my experience with that is, like especially when it comes to suggesting index hints on a problematic query that we've identified. You don't know what other parts of your stack might run a similar query that actually performs poorly with that use index you might suggest. And so in that case, you can just do it and then see what happens, and let your normal automated application test see if they flag anything bad. But the other thing you can do is just sampling some of the traffic that comes through your servers and rewriting any of those queries with the use index and see how they do. And I mean, that's a lot more time consuming. And so kind of like Shlomi said, you just kind of, I almost want to say it is kind of a gut feeling after you've dealt with your environment enough. You kind of have a better understanding of what index hints should be safe based on the way the data is distributed. And you could fire a few queries against the data set to get an idea of the cardinality of operations across different fields that you have indexed to figure out which one might be best for a given set of reads that you expect. But yeah, I mean, there's no hard and fast way. I actually, this is something that I've been kind of thinking about and trying to identify the best way that we can make index hint suggestions to our engineers for problematic queries without having a negative impact later on. So.
Right.
Sorry, Shlomi. So at Etsy, we have lots of graphs of everything, and one of the nice things about the graphs is that there are vertical deploy lines for every change that gets made. So we have, and they're each individually color coded. So network changes, actual application code changes, schema changes are all colored differently, and we can actually see those lines in relation and how those things impact. So for what I would do, trying to make a configuration change or an index change would basically just be to put it into one chart of a system and watch the graphs, let it bake in for a day and see if there is any adverse impact. If there is, you're impacting a small subset, you make your reversion and you go on knowing that you've learned something about the data set. And if things look good, then you push that change out to the rest of the farm and you see either a positive or a negative impact against that.
I got a pretty similar answer to that as well, and we use it's going to sound like a plug, but it's not. We develop MySQL Enterprise Monitor, and we use MySQL Enterprise Monitor to help us tune the application and the database, right? By doing the same, because we graph all of these different statistics over time. And also we've got this thing called Query Analyzer, which analyzes the queries and shows you the response times and things like that. So what we do is we change the underlying, or we add an index on the underlying thing that we're thinking about, and just let the monitor continue monitoring itself to see if it made a decent difference or not. So that, I mean, that's how we do it in actually evaluating indexes on the repository for the app server that we ship to people as well.
Okay, so since it seems like there's a quick quiet, I'm going to jump in again. The last 80-20 kind of gap discussion would be around schema changes and maybe new tables or altering existing tables. So kind of like optimizing bad slow queries. When do you think you're hitting kind of that breaking point on a schema change? Arguing back and forth maybe about int versus small int, and char versus varchar, or maybe the number of bytes that you allow a varchar to have. Just again, I feel like it's going to be kind of the same, but I'd like to hear if anyone has different thoughts on it.
Yeah, we really tackle this up front. So whenever a new table is created, we review the typically 2 DBAs that review that the table definition, including the engineer who wishes to create that table. So we typically minimize the damage up front. We don't typically change an int to small int later on. It just doesn't happen.
How about you, Jeremy?
Yeah, it's just a matter of pointing out the individual changes that you want to make with the developer and figuring out whether or not they're the right change or not. there's some challenge in understanding what the data is going to be used for, and you kind of work with that. A lot of what we do is let the developers make their own, and then we've got some best practices we apply sort of after the fact. We bundle up all of our schema changes and apply them on one day of the week, so it's not a constant interruption, and they're able to deploy their code shortly thereafter to make use of those fields. So it's just kind of reviewing. Our online tool for making the changes actually enforces some of those best practices and throws warnings if you're not building a table with compressed, or if you're using the wrong character set, or are doing basically a suboptimal thing. Some of those are caught without really having to educate, unfortunately. But it's a matter of education, and then kind of building tools around to do that, to prevent suboptimal things from going in. For example, storing the Unix timestamp. You're never going to have a negative timestamp for storing like a create time or a new time, so why not make it unsigned? There really isn't any storage difference, but it's still, I don't know, that's a pet peeve, I think, more than anything. But anyways, yeah, that's what it comes down to. A little bit of education, a little bit of tooling to prevent bad things from going in, and then you will find bad things in production that have skipped, or a field has gotten a new use and has run out of an unsigned int field, and you need to switch it to a big int or something like that. And those are more operational challenges that you have to face. But sometimes you don't expect things to scale the way that they scale. You hope they will, but for the short term, I think making some of those changes. Part of it is around your tooling and how easy it is for you to make those changes. So online schema change tools, the online schema stuff in 5.6 and getting better in 5.7 are all going to make people's in DBA's life better for having to go change those. They don't become quite as big of a time sink. And there is some measurement, I guess, behind that as well for, if I switch from an int to a small int, how much am I going to save on my table space? I think for a lot of people, disk space is cheap enough that it's not that big of a deal, unless you're dealing with lots and lots and lots of rows. That it actually, you do see a size savings for most data sets. Do whatever makes the most sense and change it later.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was going to chime into was, you want to pick a data type that's going to work and, probably err on the side of being more conservative, but also making sure there's room for growth. Like if there's a field is never, ever going to have more than some, maybe 255 unique values, and like numerically, or you can't even fathom having more than 10, a tiny int is probably more than sufficient, and the chance of you having to change that in the future is very low. But if you're unsure, or if you have something that maybe you're doing bit masks in, you might need an integer or a big integer to account for that. And so the other thing I wanted to throw in there too was for us, what we're kind of pushing for now is as new changes come in, so new tables and things like that, we try to ask up front, like, provide us some example queries you think you're going to run. Let's try to let's do a very gentle stab at what we think the indexing might look like, so we can just throw them in there. And I mean, if it changes, we're always going to be changing tables anyways. But if you know that your access pattern's always going to have a specific field in the query, then let's make sure we throw that out as a prefix to a lot of the indexes and things like that. And then, yeah, kind of like you said, Jeremy, it's a lot about education and just being cognizant of what kind of things are going to happen and what you need to do, and then just finding the easy things like timestamp should. There's no reason to have an assigned timestamp. Almost no reason to have assigned timestamp. Having default set, having the right data type, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so I guess we have 2 minutes left, so any last things on GAP, any last words of advice? Okay. On that, then I have a really cool blog post that I'll throw into the notes as part of this, talking about bottlenecks in enterprise, building software, and database migrations was actually one of the things in there. And then another fun thing was Morgan Talker. He had sent me an email earlier this week and said he has a blog post talking about semi-sync benchmark that he ran. So I will throw that into the notes as well, so you can check that out. And beyond that, I guess just kind of opening up for topics again. Is there anything that you all want to talk about that? We have some stuff that we didn't get to today, but are there other new things that you'd also like to talk about?
This question always
And
hits
everyone
me
goes down.
again and again.
Yeah.
I have to think about new topics. I'll just tweet them over to you.
Okay, that sounds good. I mean, Mark, is there anything on your side? Would you want to talk about some new stuff with the 5.7 development milestone, or?
I can show some stuff off if you want me to. I mean, there's plenty of stuff in there with 5.7. I mean, there's too much to talk about.
Yeah. Okay, I might coordinate with you then, see if we can get some quick and dirty demos maybe that you could do next time.
Okay.
Cool. Okay. All right. Well, then beyond that, it's 12 o'clock for me. So thanks very much for everyone who came today and participated, and we'll see you in 2 weeks, Thursday.
Okay. Later, guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.